Hello, class. Here I am once again in my favorite rocking chair, which has suddenly become very, very squeaky. And I hope that this rocking chair has helped to contribute to this course. I wanted it to sort of help me to give off the image of a caring and interested uncle. But anyway, you've made it. This is the last lesson, so congratulations. It's also one of the most exciting lessons. We'll cover civil rights, environmentalism, Vietnam, 1960s, Kennedy, Nixon, Watergate, all the way up to the Reagan administration. So it's long, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. I do want to start off mostly by discussing um, civil rights. Uh, Civil rights obviously ties in with racial tension, which had been plaguing the United States since the beginning. Uh, Reconstruction tried to tackle it, couldn't quite do it. And so now things had snowballed into actual organized movements on the behalf of African Americans. Um, what kind of instigated this in some ways was the foreign perception of the United States. Abroad, racial issues were becoming an embarrassment. The United States set itself up as sort of this bastion of freedom, but then people all over the world are seeing African Americans being beaten, and arrested, and sprayed with fire hoses, and they start to think less of the country. Uh, so it was affecting the country's image abroad, and government supported access to political rights for African Americans, but not necessarily property rights. So most Americans agreed with the ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1950s, which ended segregation. But they believed that a landowner, should not have to sell their property to an African American if they did not want to. So 60% of whites outside of the South said they would stay if a black family moved next door to them. Only 45% said they would remain in the neighborhood if large numbers of African American people moved in. So most African Americans were excluded from suburban neighborhoods. So why would this be a problem? Why would it be a problem for them financially? Uh, well, many of you probably know that the best way to accumulate capital in this country is to own a home. And if you can't get one, then it's very, very difficult to become more financially secure and to move up in society. And so, since African Americans had a hard time accruing capital because they couldn't buy homes in the suburbs, they struggled to move up the social ladder. So, in the 1950s, like the 1920s, we get this sense that the economy was doing very, very well, and it was for the most part. But urban centers in the Midwest and in other parts of the country were really struggling. And why was this? Two reasons. There were shifts in the national level in economics, race relations, and political uh, politics. Sorry, politics combined with local forces. So let's first look at national factors. What was going on with politics in the 1950s? Most of you will probably think of McCarthyism, and another term for this is anti-radicalism. So Joseph McCarthy, we talked about during the Cold War lesson, is just sort of spitballing, throwing names out, very irresponsibly accusing people of being communist, and this pours over into labor. All of a sudden, it became anti-American to be a member of a union, or unions were considered communist or socialist organizations. So unions were purged of any progressive thoughts or progressive people, and anything that was considered anti-capitalist was anti-American, which enforced consensus. Now, on the economic level, leaders looked at the national scene while ignoring regional variations. So nationally, the country's doing very well, but if you look at local areas, then you get a sense that maybe it's not doing as well as it should be. So national leaders are looking at joblessness as defections in personality, meaning that, well, the economy is doing very well on a national level, so the only explanation for people to not have jobs is because they're incapable. And where have we seen this before? This mentality that if you don't have a job, it's your own fault. Where have we seen this before? The Progressive era, right? There was also a belief that the private sector would absorb surplus labor. Again, where have we seen this? The Hoover administration, just at the beginning of the Great Depression. So now let's look at racial factors. What's going on at this moment? The Great Migration. Most African Americans were living in cities by now. They were moving into these big cities to get jobs, and then as they get there, the jobs leave. Local manufacturers want to move out of the city into new neighborhoods, or create new neighborhoods around the factory. So they move out of these city centers, and of course they move into places where whites are living. So whites get jobs there, and then the cycle starts over again. African Americans move out to that area to get the job at the factory. And then, so white people don't want to live near the African Americans, so they move further out, create new suburbs. Jobs follow that, and then, so it's a cycle. So housing, let's talk about housing. During the 1940s, African Americans were just streaming into cities, as part of the Great Migration. And the African American population in these cities doubles between 1940 and 1950. So it's huge. Huge growth, but housing doesn't grow fast enough. So white city dwellers are exposed to a certain image of African Americans at this time. If you look back at TV shows from the 1940s and 1950s, you can tell that African Americans are not depicted in the most flattering way. And this depiction, is ingrained in white Americans, and it doesn't sit well with them. So there's a long history of African Americans being depicted in this negative light. Things like Birth of a Nation, that movie that we talked about during the Progressive era, it was seen all over the country. So African Americans are depicted or seen as having lesser intelligence, physiologically better suited for certain types of jobs. They're pictured as being lazy, shiftless, and sexually deviant. So just think about some of these images, like Aunt Jemima, Amos and Andy, if you ever saw that show. They're thought of as being, all happy-go-lucky. These minstrel shows, maybe you've seen some of those, but they're depicted as sort of happy-go-lucky, a little slow-witted. They talk funny and they shuffle around. So that's how they're seen or perceived by white communities. White people, on the other hand, see themselves as the exact opposite: smart, hardworking, industrious, intelligent. All those things. And the neighborhoods segregate themselves based on these perceptions. African Americans lived in ghettos, so it must be that they are lazy. Otherwise, they'd be able to move up. Public housing was already put in urban areas, and then discriminatory housing subsidies favored whites. The GI Bill was another instance of how African Americans were discriminated against. White vets got more money than African Americans did. African Americans wanted a middle class life, but so did whites. So when you have things like, when it's easier for whites to get a house and live in the suburbs than it is for African Americans, you have these naturally segregated areas. Then also, whites and African Americans had different ideas of the role of government. So, for example, whites expected the government, both the local and the national, to protect their rights and privileges, uh, especially those rights and privileges associated with property ownership. Um, so, white homeowners could keep African Americans out. Have you ever heard of HOAs, for example? Real estate agents. These are not government sanctioned groups or organizations, but they are privately organized organizations that can, naturally segregate these areas. So African Americans, though, they don't take this lying down. They're not powerless in all of this. They worked through organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League to better their situation, and they actually won themselves more opportunities. But those who were able to progress then move out of these African American neighborhoods, and then you start to have a class division, and that would oppose, that opposes integration. And when you have this class system, um, you start to see groups, these higher class groups, oppose publicly funded housing for the poor. And so, although segregation legally was over with Brown versus Board, it continues unofficially through these housing practices. So keep that in mind as you go through this lesson.